going to introduce our guest speaker, our featured speaker. Louise Bedsworth is the Deputy Director of the OPR, the Office of Planning and Research. And those who are not aware, OPR is in the Governor's office. And in her role at OPR, Louise's role, she's actually providing the guidance. They are providing the guidance, and she is, to Governor Brown on climate change and the implementation of regulations and rules, and trying to provide guidance to the legislature and the public as a whole. And her focus has been on, again, climate change, sea level rise, and sustainable communities. And I don't want to take away her thunder. Her bio is in the program. It's a separate sheet. And if I could ask Louise to please come up here and please give her a warm welcome.
Hi. Well, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I really appreciate it. It's exciting to see so many people gathered to talk about issues of risk and readiness in a region, and really focus in on the region. It's definitely, we're seeing a lot more activity in this area, and it's very exciting, and something we're trying to work to harness at the state level as well. So I think I have a few pictures that will come up. There we go. So I'll start really with talking about a lot of what has motivated our work at OPR, and that's thinking about what California is going to look like in 2050. And so in 2050, my children are going to be my age in the midst of their careers, and thinking about what is our state going to look like at that time. We know between now and 2050, we're going to add 12 million new residents to California. We should have about 50 million people in the state by that time. Most of that growth is going to happen in the San Joaquin Valley and in the Inland Empire. We know our population is aging. We're going to have a much higher proportion of people living above the age of 65 in our communities. We have other challenges we're facing, projections of shortage of highly skilled workers and of growing income inequality. So we have a lot of changing in our demographics across the state. We also know that the climate is changing, and we're seeing that now, and as we look out to 2050 and 2100, know that temperatures are going to be increasing faster and more in the inland parts of the state, where we're expected to see that that population growth. We're going to see more warming in the summertime months. We're going to see more extreme heat events and across all parts of our state, but in places where in Southern California, we could be seeing over 100 extreme heat events a year. We'll have reductions in the state's snowpack, shifts in precipitation from snow to rain, so challenges for our water supply and our water system. We also know, and I know you all have been talking quite a bit about the projections of sea level rise. We know sea levels are rising. They are going to continue to rise. And most recently, we're starting to see projections of much more rapid ice melt and much faster sea level rise and much larger sea level rise. And so when we think about here in Oakland, it makes me wonder if my house, which is on the other side of Lake Merritt, about a mile away from Lake Merritt, will one day be a lakefront home here in Oakland. And so we don't know how much the sea level is going to rise or exactly when, and the science that is emerging is causing even more uncertainty about that. But we do know the impacts of that change are going to be very large across our state, not just here in the Bay Area. So that's kind of I don't know if it's all depressing, but it's sort of a little bit of the downer part of things as we look to 2050. We know we're changing our population, our state is growing, demographics are changing, the climate is changing. But we also know that what the future of our state looks like depends on the decisions that we're all making now at the local level, at the regional level, at the state level, and at the international level. And so as a state, we have really been working on all of those fronts to really think about how do we prepare for the risks, how do we get ready, and then how do we turn that into an opportunity for us as a state. So I think I'd just like to start, I'll focus most of my comments on what we're doing around adaptation and resilience, but it's important to remember that's part of an integrated climate strategy that the state has been implementing now for over 10 years, going back actually to the previous administration and even the administration before that. So when we look out, the core of what we're doing is really working to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. We have AB 32, which established our 2020 greenhouse gas emission reduction target that we have been showing we are on the track to meet that target through a suite of policies: cleaner vehicles, cleaner fuels, renewable electricity, energy efficiency. And then from that, we know getting to that 2020 target has taken a lot of effort. But when we look at where we need to be by the middle of the century, if we want to reduce emissions to minimize the worst of the impacts of climate change, we need to reduce emissions at 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And so that decline from 2020 to 2050 is a much steeper ramp down than it was for us to get to 2020. And so looking at that, Governor Brown has recognized that we need a target to start us on that steeper path. So in April of last year, he established our 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction target of 40% below 1990 emissions by 2030. And so we are in the process right now of developing the plan for how we are going to meet that target. And what are all of the elements that are going to go into that. That include, again, energy efficiency, renewable energy, stewardship and conservation of our natural and working lands to store carbon and also to boost resilience. The governor has also taken a very active role in engaging a number of partners around the world in this effort, knowing that what we do in California is incredibly important as one of the world's largest economies, but that as a share of global emissions, we need many others along with us to do this. And so in May of last year, he started the Under 2 Memorandum of Understanding, or the Under 2 MOU, and now about 130 other, mostly subnational governments have signed on with a commitment to make deep emission reductions on the order of about 80 to 90% below 1990 levels by 2050. But the Under 2 refers to the emission reductions necessary to keep warming below 2 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. And so those elements of work are really critical, and I think go also alongside in the executive order where he established our 2030 greenhouse gas emission reduction targets. He also laid out a number of steps on adaptation and resilience, I think really signaling the integration of our climate policy to address both the reduction and the readiness side of the equation. So, foundational to the state's climate policy, when we look back to the early 2000s, but even before that, has been understanding the risk that climate change poses to the state. And California has been lucky in that we have had the resources, we have the financial resources and also the intellectual resources here within the state to have been able to produce a suite of very comprehensive assessments of the risks that climate change will pose to the state. And this began actually in the 80s and 90s, but then starting back in the early 2000s, we started doing these multi-sectoral comprehensive assessments. We've now completed 3 California climate change assessments. They've been integral in forming the foundation for the policies we've adopted. The first greenhouse gas emission reduction standard for passenger vehicles was adopted here in California. Our climate assessment work was really pivotal in building the case around the need for that regulation. And then, of course, the passage of AB 32 was grounded in the science and the assessment of risk to the state. California is currently just launching its 4th climate change assessment. Folks here may have been following that process. We've invested approximately $9 million in further understanding the risk to the state, so looking at downscaled scenarios of climate impacts, looking at developing quasi-probabilistic estimates of sea level rise, which are really looking at using expert elicitation to try to give some sense of the probability of different outcomes in that range of sea level rise. And then the interest in this assessment was really driven to inform action and activity at the state agency level. So how do we help state agencies take the steps that they need to take to get ready for a changing climate? So the scope of work that has formed the basis of the 4th assessment really came from that conversation at the state. What do we need to know? Of course, as you can imagine, it's limited. The resources that are available are limited, but we are able in this instance to have every project in the assessment really linked to informing action on the ground. There's going to be new climate scenarios for the state out this summer that will incorporate the latest international emission scenarios, as well as looking at the Paris Agreement scenario. So what does it look like if all of the agreements are met? What do emissions look like, and what do impacts look like? And then complete results will be available in 2018. We've also, through this work, been able to work with the National Climate Assessment to align a lot of our assessment work with what they are doing. And also thinking a lot about tools and guidance. So you may be familiar with CalAdapt, which is a state tool that provides an easy interface to come look at climate impacts at a more local scale. We're working now that is in the process of being updated, linking that to our adaptation planning guide, so really helping communities, regions, and state agencies to understand risk, to be able to visualize the risk in a spatial way over time, and link that as easily as possible into planning and decision-making that is happening on the ground. So at OPR, we develop general plan guidelines for all cities and counties, and we've been doing the first comprehensive update to those guidelines since 2003. And the final public draft will be out later on this summer. But in that, really working to integrate climate change throughout that document, drawing on tools like CalAdapt and others to really allow local governments to access information on climate change and to access tools and guidance for how to plan for and prepare in the face of that change. So that's really a lot of the work that we have done at the state to try to characterize, communicate, and understand the risk that climate is posing. And then I think in the last couple of years, really taken some very exciting steps to really thinking about how do we get ready for the risk that we're facing. And with the passage of Executive Order B3015, for those who keep track of the numbers, which was signed last April, I think lays out one of the most comprehensive approaches to adaptation and resilience probably anywhere in the country, really touching on thinking about local and regional coordination, thinking about infrastructure, and all investment across the board. So within that executive order, there is a directive that all state agencies consider climate impacts in all planning and investment. It also requires us to regularly update Safeguarding California, which is our state climate adaptation strategy, calls for the use of full life cycle cost accounting in all infrastructure projects, and then it lays out some principles of adaptation for the state. And so when we think about the principles that are going to inform all of the work that we have going forward, the executive order reiterates several elements that are captured in Safeguarding California. The first is to prioritize natural and green infrastructure. So where we can, to think about blending and utilizing natural and green infrastructure in all of the work that we're doing. This is a big shift for the state to really think about this in our work, and it's requiring a lot of effort around defining exactly what is natural and green infrastructure. How do you use it? How do you blend it with traditional gray infrastructure? And so it's really opened up a conversation there where in some areas, in regions and sectors, we've been doing a lot more of that kind of work, and others much less. So thinking about how do we infuse that across the way we make infrastructure decisions at the state level. Next, it calls for protecting and prioritizing the protection of the most vulnerable in California. And so this is really opening up a conversation about what is vulnerability, how do we characterize it, how do we think about protecting those who are most vulnerable. And there are many elements to this. And this is another area that is being addressed right now through a technical advisory group that's providing guidance to state agencies for how do you do this? How do we identify most vulnerable? How do we assure protections and build that into in an integrated way into our climate adaptation policy? And this is not really this is about really better understanding how social systems fit into into thinking about resilience, and how do we bring that into our decision making more directly. And so one way I often like to characterize this is if you're going to build a new structure, is that we're thinking not just about the risks to that structure of a changing climate, but how constructing that is going to affect the surrounding community. So we can think about things like urban heat island. We can think about mobility. We can think about issues that are related to community vulnerability and resilience as well, and not just the risks to that structure that we're building. Another principle is to try to link mitigation and adaptation to the fullest extent possible. And this is not always going to be possible, but there are many instances where we can do both, where we can think about energy efficiency, water efficiency, many of our efficiency mechanisms clearly fall into that category, but also a lot of our natural restoration and conservation work in natural and working lands can provide dual benefits. This is a really interesting opportunity, and you'll see, I think, more and more in state legislation and in policy talking about integrated climate action. And one of the benefits of trying to think in a more integrated way about climate action is what that means for funding and how we can tap into as many different sources of funding to do this work as possible. And then finally, the fourth principle is to coordinate with local and regional partners. And I think this is, and I'll touch on each of these a little bit more as I talk about what we're sort of thinking about how we're planning. But this is, I think, important in that it's called out very specifically in the executive order to work with regional partners. We've been thinking a lot. We take a very sectoral approach at the state. When we look at Safeguarding California, it has 10 sectors in it: energy, public health, emergency management. And I think we are trying to think a lot more about how do we integrate across those sectors. And one way to do that is to take a more systems approach and also to think at a more regional level. And so I think that is an important shift that we'll start to see more and more, particularly as we think about adaptation. So building off of the executive order, the last element of it was a directive for OPR, for our office, to form a technical advisory group to assist state agencies to implement this executive order. And so that process has just been getting underway this year, and we will be doing it over the course of this calendar year, so hope to have a guidance document at the end. But really, which is sort of, okay, now if we're going to really integrate climate impacts into everything we're doing, what does that mean? What is planning and investment? How do we do that? And so we've been grappling with all of those elements, sticking to the principles, but then also just thinking about, okay, how do you make this actionable? So we can't go to a state agency and say, hey, think about climate. It's got to be a little more prescriptive and a little bit more actionable than that. So as we've gone forward with our technical advisory group, we're really looking on two fronts. One is thinking about what we plan for. So what is it? We know we have to plan for a different future. We can't use historical data to think about the future. So can we provide guidance on what do you need to plan for? What kind of change? What magnitude of change are we thinking about? We have provided sea level rise guidance to state agencies. Can we do that for other impacts as well? Can we think about, within the context of your project, here's the kind of change you need to think about. We're also working with state agencies to better understand what's the critical parameter around which you plan. Not everyone plans around annual average temperature. So can we understand and can we take some of the data that we are producing and turn it into that information that is relevant for planning? We're also really trying to think about how we learn from the experiences that we are having today. We think about the El Nino season. We went into that really trying to think about how do we, one, get ahead of the curve if, in the event of large storms, but what can we learn from what happened this winter? From the wildfires that we've been having, we've had pretty record wildfires in terms of the fire behavior and the fire intensity. What can we learn from those, both about how we make communities more resilient, but then how do we have to partner to manage our resources? I think, so that is one piece that it's tricky, but it's actually fairly concrete. It is working with our agencies, working with our researchers to try to provide some information around what to plan for. We hear that a lot. Just tell me what to plan for. Just give me a number. We know that's hard, but we're trying to work to provide a contextual number, maybe is the way to think about it. I think the bigger challenge for us is we can't just change what we plan for, we have to change how we're planning. So the process that we go through has to change in a number of ways. And so how do we sort of take this large entity, which is in our case, our focus right now is on the state and how we plan, and this gets into the minutia of how you interact with the Department of General Services and what's in the state administrative manual and all of that. How do we start shifting that to work in a more uncertain, changing world? And so one way that is often talked about is taking a pathways approach. This looks basically like a subway map. And this is from an academic paper, and I'll admit it's hard to think about how to make it really practical, but I think what it really is how do we build in checkpoints? How do we take an adaptive management approach? How do we start building that into what you do? How do we make that necessary? So if you're going to put in a request for an infrastructure project through your capital outlay budget change proposal, what do you need to do to show that you're thinking about being more adaptive in the future? And so this is the work that we're doing through this technical advisory group. And so what we really are hoping to get to is an action plan for state agencies that says, here's what you're going to plan for, and here are the steps to implement these principles. And here are, and it sounds ridiculous when I say it, but I'm going to say it anyway, which is we're really trying to get to like a checklist. So we're taking this very complicated process and trying to get it down to very simple terms that you can easily integrate into the steps that you do for planning. Of course, all of this is happening right now under the directive of an executive order. It's unusual, but the legislature often likes to have a say too. So last year there was a package of bills that was passed that codifies many of these elements of this executive order. And also some go a bit further. Senate Bill 379 is going to require all local and all county and city general plans to incorporate climate change into their safety element. AB 1482 has made the requirement that Safeguarding California be regularly updated. And then perhaps of most interest here is Senate Bill 246, which is going to be implemented through OPR, and it develops an integrated climate adaptation and resilience program within OPR that is designed to facilitate state, local, and regional coordination on climate adaptation. There are many elements to it, and we're still sort of figuring out exactly what that looks like. It's new for us to have a program underneath us, so we're working out what that'll look like. But there are different elements to it. One of that is going to be a technical advisory committee, because we like a lot of committees and groups. And that is going to be interesting because that actually is going to be a public-facing body, because it's created through legislation, to start this coordination with the Resources Agency and Cal EPA and the Climate Action Team to think about how we really build this local and regional and state coordination into planning and policy. So it's a nice pathway forward. We're also going to be forming a clearinghouse of information that we hope will be integrated into Cal Adapt, that will be sort of case studies, best practices. So I think finally I'll just conclude with basically what is it that we're trying to work towards in doing this. And I think one, and is really just to think about how do we build on the ground, get this shift from planning and risk, we've done a lot of that, to actually translate this into actual action on the ground. And we've had one big success so far, at least the first stage of success, and that is up in Tuolumne County. For folks who remember, in 2013, we had the Rim Fire that burned up in Tuolumne County, mostly in Stanislaus National Forest, but a bit in Yosemite National Park. It's the largest wildfire on forested land in the state's history. Much like the fires of this summer, it burned in a very intense and unpredictable way. It burned for 2 months, and it was exceptionally destructive. In this case, we're very lucky. There were very few houses, only a few that were in the forest that were burned. But what it really signaled was a need to change our approach to managing the forest, to working with the communities, and working across levels of government. And we put together a proposal this year to the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development through their National Disaster Resilience Competition, proposing to put forward a community and watershed resilience program that really looked at the core of the issue, which gets to forest management, community resilience, economic resilience, and how do we put all of these pieces together on the ground to start to be able to have healthier forests and watersheds, to help communities that are in those areas not be as impacted by events like this, and critically to protect the state's water supply. This fire happened right near the watershed for the city and county of San Francisco. It's also where about 3/4 of the state's water flows through the watersheds up in the mountains. And so we were just awarded $70 million from HUD to implement this integrated program that's going to link biomass utilization, so thinking about small-scale wood products and bioenergy, with forest management, with community resilience, linking in the California Conservation Corps, job creation, many elements. I point to this because it was a great success to think about taking some of our concepts that we've had, putting them in on the ground. The award came through HUD with a lot of support, obviously from the Forest Service, and what's really being looked to now as we implement this is this as a model for all of the Western United States. And so this is the opportunity I think we have here in California, is we've conceptualized a lot of the risks we're facing, we have a lot of plans in place, and we're poised to be able to really start implementing on the ground a number of these steps. And I think puts us in a wonderful position as a state to think about our well-being, but then also to be competitive across the country to get funds to actually do this work. So, thank you.